Hi, I'm Steven Feuerstein, and I write practically perfect PLSQL.
Greetings and welcome to the SQL Channel, a series of video trainings in the Oracle PLSQL language. My name is Steven Feuerstein, and I'm a PL/SQL developer just like you. This lesson is part of my series on Dynamic SQL and Dynamic PL/SQL, and the focus of this lesson is executing dynamic DML statements with bind variables. This is method 2 Dynamic SQL. So, method 2. Method 2 Dynamic SQL involves executing dynamic DML statements, update, delete, merge, inserts with a fixed number of bind variables. Now, what I mean by bind variables is that you're going to be binding expressions to placeholders in the dynamic SQL string with the using clause of execute immediate. So first of all, what's a placeholder? Well, when you're constructing a string with SQL statements inside of it, you can reference a placeholder, basically reference a point in which a value needs to be put into your dynamic SQL statement using a colon and then a name or even conceivably an integer value. Here's an example of an integer placeholder and a string placeholder. So whenever you see the colon followed immediately by a name or an integer, you know that that's a placeholder. And when you run the SQL statement, Oracle needs a value to stick into that placeholder, to bind a value into it. And the way you bind is with the using clause. So here's a quick initial example. I'm constructing my DML string inside a loop. My table is dynamic, so I have to do this with execute immediate. I construct my update statement. Notice I've got a placeholder here, a placeholder here, and a placeholder here, strings and integers. And then in my execute immediate statement, I have a using clause, and then I specify a variable or an expression for each one of the placeholders in my string. Dynamic SQL method 2 means that at the time I write my SQL statement and at the time the code is compiled, I know how many different placeholders I've got. 1, 2, 3, and therefore my using clause can specify my 3 expressions. If I don't know how many bind variables I've got, maybe 2, maybe 16, that's a much more complex scenario, and that's called method 4 Dynamic SQL, and that's treated and addressed in a separate lesson. So in this lesson, we're assuming that at the time you compile your code, you know how many bind variables you've got, which is certainly the most common kind of scenario for method 2 DML operations. Let's get into a bit more detail on the using clause and look at a bunch of examples. When you specify a value in the using clause, you can also specify its mode, essentially the same as parameters in, out, and in out. In is the default. If you don't specify anything, you get in, just like parameters. Out and in out are really used for dynamic PL/SQL. When you're doing dynamic DML operations, insert, update, deletes, you're only passing values in. The number of placeholders must match the number of bind variables, even if you have the same placeholder referenced more than once. Basically, the expressions are allocated positionally. You cannot bind expressions of PL/SQL data type, for example, records, booleans, associative arrays. The using clause is passing or binding values into the SQL statement, and therefore only SQL types are supported. This is true even for dynamic PLSQL, which is addressed in a separate lesson. Essentially, the data type must be known to the SQL layer in order to do the binding. Finally, you cannot bind parts of the SQL statement that are needed for parsing. So for example, if I have a dynamic column name or a table name or a where clause, a chunk of text, I cannot use a bind variable in the using clause to bind that information in. Instead, I must concatenate. All right, let's take a look at a whole bunch of examples. I'm going to create a copy of my employees table so any changes I make will not be affecting my main table. And first what I'm going to do is demonstrate that you can't bind parts of the SQL statement needed for parsing. So set to 10,000, I want to set all the employees' salaries, or sorry, the dynamic part of my statement is I'm passing in the column name and the department ID. So in my DML statement, my column name is dynamic. it's not known at compile time, and therefore it's not a static DML statement. And in my first attempt to write my DML statement, I'm going to try to bind in the name of the column with a placeholder. And then I'm going to give everybody a salary, or the specified column, salary, commission, etc. I'm going to set their value to 10,000 for the specified department ID. So everybody in department 50 will get a salary of $10,000. And then after I run my statement, I'll see how many rows I modified. So first of all, will this code even compile? And the answer is yes, no problem. Because it's a dynamic SQL string, Oracle doesn't really take a look at how it's constructed, what it might do until runtime. And at runtime, when I try to say update the employee salaries to 10,000 for department ID 50, well, Oracle complains. Invalid user table column, table.column, or column specification. In other words, it found that you were trying to specify a column without actually giving the column name, and that's not valid. So dynamic table names, column names, where clauses, from clauses, all of that stuff have to be concatenated in. So let's take a look at doing it right, and then also binding in various kinds of variables. Okay, my set to 10,000 program takes the same column, department ID. Now I'm going to say update the employees table, set the column name is concatenated in, equal to 10,000 for the specified department ID. So then I can run this program, set to 10,000 for the salary, 50, and now I don't have the problem of having to bind in the column name. So I think this is going to work. We'll try it. But first of all, note at the top of this script when you run it yourself that you'll need to run the TabCount NDS script first. Let's take a look at that. The TabCount function is actually a function using Dynamic SQL method 3, which we haven't covered yet. So if you're not familiar with querying data dynamically, this might be a little bit new to you, and you'll learn all about it in lesson 3. But essentially what I'm going to do is, instead of writing select count star over and over again, I've got a separate program that will do the select count star for me from the specified table and the specified where clause. So there's the concatenation of the where clause. And again, it cannot be bound in. I've got to concatenate it. Now, some of you with lots of experience might look at this and say this is a dangerous thing to do because it might introduce the possibility of SQL injection. I talk about SQL injection in my best practices for dynamic SQL, and it's absolutely true that it does raise this possibility. We're not going to worry about that for this simple utility. I'm going to compile table count. What that lets me do is, inside my script, after creating my program, say, after creating my program, that should work, show me the table count for everybody in the employees M2 table where department ID equals 50 and salary equals 10,000. So I'm supplying an entire where clause as well as the schema name and the table name. So the before count and then the after count. First of all, let's create this procedure. So there's my dynamic update statement. Here's my binding, and if I want to, I can also say using in, and that will compile as well. Now let's try running it. Now I don't get an error, and in fact I see that 45 rows were updated in the process of performing this update statement. So the before count was 0, the after count 45. And notice also that as a part of my procedure, I check to see the number of rows modified. So SQL %row count will also reflect the number of rows modified by a dynamic SQL statement, essentially the most recent SQL statement executed. That will give you the row count for the number of rows modified. Okay, that worked. Let's see what happens if I change my bind variable type to out. Oh, look at this. It won't even let me compile. Expression department ID cannot be used as an assignment target. So it's saying you can't pass the value back in. Well, the problem here is that is probably not what I want to show you. Since this is an in parameter, it's saying you can't change it, and that's a value coming back. So let's just make that a little bit different. Department is a number. Let's put it here. Whoops. Let's put it here. Try to compile. And now Oracle does compile my program. It says, okay, you want to use that as an out, that's fine. Let's try running it. And it says outbound variable bound to an in position. So it's trying to get the value to put it in something, and then I've specified it as out, so that will not work. So you've got to have the mode set correctly. Generally speaking, people just don't include the mode, just using that variable puts it in. Okay, so that's a single bind variable. Let's take a look at using multiple bind variables. I'm going to pass in the column name, the department ID, and the value that I want to set the salary or the commission or whatever it is to. So now my statement is a bit more complex. I'm going to set my column value equal to the specified value for that department ID, but it's no big deal. I simply provide two expressions, or variables in this case, or parameters in this case, that will be bound into the statement. When I do this, I should again see the same 45. Run my code, and I see 45 rows updated. So again, if you have multiple bind variables, you simply have to, multiple placeholders, you have to make sure that you have the same number of bind variables in your using clause. And that's true even if you have duplicates of the same. So here's an example of my same update numeric value procedure, column department ID value. But now I've said set the column equal to that specified value for this department ID, and only if the value that I've passed in is not null. Now clearly what I should have done is say if val in is not null. So this doesn't really need to be a bind variable, but let's just assume we did it that way. So I've got 1, 2, 3 placeholders. I have to have 1, 2, 3 placeholders inside my using clause. So Oracle assigns them positionally, and in fact, if I wanted to, I could provide different values. I could say val in times 100 here. It doesn't have to be the same expression, but you have to provide a value for each element in the list. Let's try that. Now first of all, let's go back to just 2. So I've got 3 placeholders, 2 bind variables. Will this code even compile? And the answer is yes, it will compile, because Oracle isn't looking inside the string at compile time. All that processing is deferred till runtime. When I try to run the program, then it tells me, hey, wait a minute. I've got to bind 3 different values to 3 placeholders, and not all of them were bound. So that's the error you get if you have a mismatch in the number. But if I add the value in here as well, then I have no problem. So make sure your bind variables and your placeholders match up by number. And by the way, that's only true for Dynamic SQL. When we talk about Dynamic PL/SQL, you'll see that in some cases the number of placeholders do not have to match the number of bind variables. Oracle works things differently when you have the same placeholder referenced more than once. So that's Dynamic PL/SQL. Finally, let's take a look at what's involved in trying to bind to a non-SQL data type. In Oracle 9.2 and higher, you can use the set row syntax to update an entire row at a time with a PL SQL record. So I want to do that dynamically. I'm going to pass in a record, the department ID, and the value. And I'm going to try to update the entire row to that record. So colon, row data, there's my placeholder. And in my using clause, I have my record. And we actually don't need that second value. Let's see what happens when I try to compile this. It tells me expressions have to be of SQL types. That's a very clear statement. I love those kinds of errors. We know exactly what the problem is. Oracle has no way to know what a record structure is. It'd be nice if it did. It really should. But it doesn't work that way. PL SQL is a superset of SQL. It knows about SQL, and it can work with SQL types. SQL doesn't know anything about PL SQL. So you can't bind records, you can't bind associative array types, you can't bind booleans, and so on. So lots of different examples. Play around with those yourself. Make sure you understand all these different nuances. Let's move on. Method 2 and the returning clause. So you can use the returning clause with DML, both static and dynamic, to retrieve information about the effect of the DML statement just executed. Essentially, for example, when I insert into a table, I might call the sequence.nextVal right inside my insert statement to generate the next primary key. And then I need that primary key back in my PL SQL code. rather than having to do a separate select statement to get it after the insert is finished, I can request the employee ID of the primary key value right inside the insert statement, and therefore I avoid an extra context switch, and that will improve the performance of my code. Well, you can use the returning clause with your DML statement dynamically, and if you do so, then you also need to add a returning clause to your execute immediate statement. And if the DML statement that you're executing dynamically changes more than one row, you're going to have to do a bulk collect to retrieve all the different values in your returning clause. Let's check it out. Again, I'll make a copy of my employees table, and let's take a look at set one row. I pass in the column name, I pass in the employee ID, and I want to give that employee a salary of $10,000 or a commission of $10,000, whatever the column name is. So I set that column equal to 1,000, 10,000 for that employee ID. There's my binding of my placeholder. Now I want to find out the last name of the person who got the raise, so I say returning last name into and then another placeholder. Now this placeholder does not appear in the using clause. Instead, notice my execute immediate, my update string. Using, I have a single in bind variable in my using clause. I have a separate returning into clause for execute immediate that specifies the variable containing the name. Compile this code. It compiles no problem. And by the way, if I try to use this in my using clause, so that's going in, this is going out, it'll compile, but it won't run. Let's try that first. So in my first approach, I've said, well, this is pretty clear. This one's coming in, this one's going out, so just specify it as an outbind variable. But when I try to run this, I see, what do I see? Wait a minute, did it work? Can I do that? I wouldn't have thought so. Let's run that once more. It's telling me that it did find and update styles. Is this really? Maybe you can do it this way as well. So I compile this procedure, set one row. Okay, well, it looks like you can use it in the out clause as well. Interesting. I had thought that you had to say returning, so it looks like you can do it both ways. Fascinating. Let's go back to the original formulation because I think that also makes the most sense. So we take this procedure. Now we match up the returning with returning into. Let's compile that. And now let's run this version. And again, we see that styles is updated. Well, that's interesting. Again, I wasn't aware of that. You can actually do it both ways. I suggest you use the returning clause because that more clearly aligns with the returning into clause of execute immediate, because that more clearly aligns with the returning clause in the DML statement. So that's with a single row change. Let's see what happens if multiple rows are being changed. Now I'm going to pass in the column and the department ID, give everybody in that department the $10,000 salary or commission. Now let's try it first with returning into. So I'm going to compile my program. And yes, I'm going to say returning into that name. I run my code, and I get exact fetch returns more than one requested than the requested number of rows. When I say returning into, that's saying just get me a single value back. Obviously, it's a single name. But returning might return multiple rows of data. In fact, in this case, the department ID, department 50, has lots of rows in it. So it tried to fit multiple values into this single value. Doesn't work. So the bottom line is that when you're using the returning clause and the returning and the DML statement may or will update more than one row of data, then you have to say returning bulk collect into. Now bulk collect is part of the bulk processing feature set of PL SQL, and that's explained in a separate set of lessons on turbocharging SQL performance in PL SQL. So if bulk collect is new to you, check it out, learn all about it. It's a fantastic feature. And if I take this approach, and run my code, notice the name updated. Well, the name updated, actually, let me fix this a little bit. Number of names updated. So I'm going to do execute immediate, bind in my department ID, returning bulk collect into a collection of strings, a list of strings, the type of which is defined in DBMS SQL. And then I'm going to say, show me the number of names that were updated. So let's just do that one more time. My apologies for not explaining it better first. Number of names updated, 45. So there are 45 employees in Department 50. So when you're retrieving more than one row in the returning clause, or when you're changing more than one row in your DML statement, the returning clause will return more than one value. You simply say, you don't say bulk collect into in the DML statement, but when I'm getting the information back out, then you need the bulk collect. And last, you can also use method 2 Dynamic SQL with a ForAll statement. Again, ForAll is part of the bulk processing feature set. It will greatly improve the performance of repetitive executions of the same DML statement. And you can definitely use it with your execute immediate. So you simply include execute immediate under the ForAll header. The using clause now references the bind array. In other words, you have to bind an array or collection into the DML statement, and now that's in the using clause using the ForAll iterator. So ForAll, here's the iterator, just like a for loop. Here's my DML statement, my dynamic DML statement. Here's the execute immediate. And in my using clause, I need to make sure that I have a value for every placeholder, just like you saw with the other non-ForAll dynamic SQL. But in this case, notice I'm going to use the binding array and reference the iterator inside my using clause. So that says use this element of the collection, bind it into that iteration of the update statement. And then, since I have the returning clause, I need a returning bulk collect into, and then my list of names that are being modified. Let's take a look at the example. So I declare a nested table of numbers, a nested table of strings. And by the way, if you're not familiar with collections and what a nested table is, you should watch my series of lessons on collections. Update employees. Pass in the column name, pass in the list of employees that need to get the update, need to get a 10% raise. So update the employees table, set column equal to column times 1.1 for the specified employee ID, and get the last name of the employee who was modified and put it into my second placeholder. The using clause says use this element of the array, matching up the iterator name, returning bulk collect into my list of names, and then show me all the names of the people who got the raise. So I'm going to iterate through my list of names and display the values. Now before I run this, let's first try it with a problem. In other words, not doing it correctly. So let's take this procedure. And first of all, I want to show you that you have to reference this index. So for example, if I put 1 here, notice it tells me DML statement without bulk in bind cannot be used inside ForAll. I didn't bind in the value. The iterator is not referenced anywhere in my statement. It's not valid. I have to provide the indexing. So that link up has to be in the statement. Oracle will catch it at compile time. If I leave off my returning, if I got a returning here and no returning in my using clause, Oracle will not catch that at compile time. It compiled. It'll catch it when I try to run it. So now if I try to run this statement, run this procedure, it tells me not all variables are bound because I can bind this element, this variable, into :1, but there's nothing for :2. So let's go back to the original version that should work correctly. Clear out our output from the last run. So now I'm going to execute my DML statement dynamically inside ForAll. I've got my iterator being referenced in my using clause, and I've got returning bulk collect to retrieve my names. I run my code, no errors, and I see the names of the 2 employees for 138 and 147. for 138 and 147, they both got their 10% raise. Draw some conclusions. Dynamic SQL Method 2 introduces the need for the using clause. That's what Method 2 means. You have a fixed number of bind variables known at the time of compilation. So I have a using clause to basically match up my actual values with my placeholders, and you need to make sure that the number of placeholders always matches the number of bind variables, even if the placeholder name is used multiple times. You need a distinct set of bind variables in your using list. You can only bind in SQL compatible expressions, so Booleans, records, associative arrays cannot be used with Dynamic SQL, even with Dynamic PLSQL. And you can execute Method 2 Dynamic SQL as part of a ForAll statement.